The issue is if you're in Moscow right now and you're looking at the strategic picture in the West, it's becoming increasingly clear that you're going to have to launch an offensive in order to bring this to some sort of conclusion. Then hope that the Europeans will want to negotiate separately. And I think that the probability of that happening is growing with each passing day. Germany has now slipped into a very severe recession that could easily turn into a depression. Hundreds of thousands of Germans have lost their jobs in very important industries, chemical industries, anything that is petroleum based, obviously, heavy industry. Germany is really the engine of prosperity for the European Union. And as Germany sinks deeper and deeper into recession, more and more people lose their jobs, the impact on the rest of Europe is going to be profound. And once it becomes clear that the standard of living is falling dramatically, things are unaffordable or you can't get them, particularly food, then I think the people in charge are in a lot of trouble. So that's in the future. I can't predict when that will happen, but that's definitely going to happen. The question is, how long do the Russians wait? And I don't think they're going to wait very long. I think they're going to use the summer to try and wrap this up as much as they possibly can.
I thought maybe I got this wrong, but I thought that they don't do stuff too much when the ground is when it's warm because the mud is so thick. You're not really
No, that's true. But the ground is now solidifying in Ukraine. It's now hard enough to support the movement of large numbers of armored vehicles. That's for both sides, Ukrainians and Russians. Remember, the mud is agnostic. It cuts both ways. It stops Ukrainians, it stops Russians. That's why you've been watching these World War I style infantry battles, because you just could not move large maneuver forces. That's about to change. And I think the Ukrainians will open the summer with some sort of offensive. I don't think it'll work. I think they'll take terrible losses, and I think the Russians will then counterattack.
So is Russia going to have to go all the way to Kiev to get them to submit? Is that, I mean, in their calculation?
Well, I think that the probability of that being the case is growing with each passing day. Again, the Russians don't want to rule Ukrainians. I mean, Putin has said this several times. He's not interested in, quote unquote, conquering Ukraine, never was. All he wanted was neutrality for Ukraine. And what we did is we rejected neutrality in favor of the so-called NATO membership, but we had already spent 8 years from 2014 until 2022 building up this huge Ukrainian army, equipping it, training it, staffing it with the best officers and non-commissioned officers that we could find, and then preparing to launch it against the Russians. I think if the Russians had not attacked it, probably by the summer of 2022, you would probably have seen limited Ukrainian offensives against Russians in eastern Ukraine. Remember, all of this is about the fact that the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, and that's almost a third of the Ukrainian population that speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, they were oppressed. They were treated as third-class citizens inside Ukraine. They were forced to either, quote unquote, Ukrainianize or leave the country. So the Minsk agreements were designed to address this, but as we found out from Merkel and Macron in Europe, those agreements were a fraud. They were never serious. They were simply designed to buy time for the expansion and growth of Ukrainian military power. So now most of that military power is being destroyed. You have very few people with any experience that have survived combat and are capable left. That's why the return of these 30 to 35,000 from overseas is so important. So this is sort of the last gasp that I think the Ukrainians can manage on the ground. The Russians will dispatch it. And again, I think the Russians have figured out we're going to have to go to the river, to the Dnieper. We're going to have to turn south, take Odessa, turn north, take Kharkov. Those are the things that they were interested in to begin with because that's where the Russians live. They don't really want to cross the river and try to manage or rule Western Ukraine. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They know that the Ukrainians don't want to be ruled from Moscow. But they feel compelled at this point to continue further simply because we've made it clear that whatever remains of Ukraine, we will transform into some sort of battering ram to be used against Russia. Russia's not going to accept that. The analogy would be If we discovered that the Chinese or the Russians or someone else was trying to transform Mexico into a platform for attack against the United States. Now, some people would say that's already happened with the drug cartels. That's another subject, and I agree that something we should be much more concerned about that than what's happening in Ukraine. But the point is, we would not tolerate foreign forces on the ground in Mexico building up an anti-American force. We would destroy it. Well, that's essentially what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But we don't want to rule Mexicans either. We want the Mexicans to govern themselves. And the Russians want the Ukrainians to govern themselves, but they want neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And that condition is not going to change.
So how spent is Russia in terms of how many soldiers do they have? How many have they lost? How many are in the best quality to continue this type of war? Their economic and weapons situation, where are they at? How spent are they in this whole?
Well, their economy is booming. They're doing land office business. Their exports, particularly of minerals and petroleum products, is at an all-time high. There is a meeting that will occur later this month in St. Petersburg involving 84 countries. And all of these countries are interested in what Russia and China are billing as gold-backed currency. All of these countries want to get out from under the US-dominated financial system in the West. And the only way to do that is to go to, first and foremost, gold-backed currency trading. Now, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, obviously the Saudis and many of the Emirates have stockpiled an enormous quantity of gold. So they're ready to move in this direction. This would cut us out of the loop and essentially remove the burden of dealing with us through our system. This also means that they stop trading in dollars, which means we can't pass on our debt to them anymore, which is effectively what happens when they do business with us in dollars. Those 84 countries plus Russia, India, China, I think they have a very good chance of bringing this off. So that's the first thing. The point is that economically, we have not hurt Russia at all. Russia has boomed. Secondly, militarily, their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to produce military equipment of all types and kinds, everything from cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, all the way to tanks and aircraft and rifles. So there is no shortage of equipment. Lastly, manpower. Well, they right now have about 800,000+ in the Russian army, and that number continues to grow. There are certainly 700,000 either involved in the Ukrainian operation or serving in Russia in support of it. There are probably 300,000 to 400,000 Russian combat troops between Belarusia, up north, White Russia, and southern Ukraine ready to strike as needed. So they're in a very good position. But as I said at the beginning of this discussion, one of the things that is now being discussed behind the scenes in Moscow is the potential for total mobilization. If they go to a full mobilization force, then you're talking about 2 million men in the Russian army.
All coming into Ukraine, or not all coming in, right?
Well, you know, this all depends on us. I mean, they don't want to do these things, but if we are going to stand fast on our insistence that whatever remains of Ukraine has to be part of NATO, has to be hostile to Russia, has to host foreign forces, has to potentially host missile systems that we would put on the ground that threaten Russia, which was always on the agenda. As long as we insist upon that, the chances of the Russians going to full-blown mobilization are quite real.